The next aspect of this topic that I would like to discuss with you, it's not the territories which were annexed, but the state of human rights in on this territory and how people live under the control of Russian authorities. So we have a brief material on this topic. And situation with human rights in occupied Crimea becomes worse and worse. It is stated by experts of all world movement, Amnesty International, in particular Crimean Tatars are discriminated more than other categories of people. What happens in reality and what measures are taken? Watching the following story by Anna Bilaeva.
European Parliament calls on Russia to start a dialogue with Ukraine on the return of control over the peninsula and stop political repression. This was stated in the European Parliament resolution approved on February 4 on human rights in the occupied Crimea, which was supported by 80% of MEPs. Ukrainian human rights activists claim that for the moment in Crimea in custody, 8 people are illegally detained. 3 of them, Ahtem Chaygos, Mustafa Degermanji, Ali Asanov, are in the so-called case of February 26. They were recognized as political prisoners by Russian human rights organization Memorial. Recalling that after the annexation of Crimea, the occupational authorities started a trial on Crimean Tatar activists who 2 years ago took part in action in support of territorial integrity of Ukraine. Moreover, Afanasyev, Kolchenko and Sentov were also recognized as political prisoners. Russian court blames Ukrainians in terroristic activity on the territory of the occupied peninsula and sentenced them to 7, 10 and 20 years of imprisonment accordingly. To get an information on human rights in late January, to the Crimea arrived mission of the Council of Europe, which held more than 50 meetings with representatives of all sectors of society. European Parliament recognized the unprecedented level of human rights violations in the occupied Crimea. MEPs considered unacceptable an abduction and torture of Crimean Tatars, Ukrainians and anyone else who disagrees with the annexation of the peninsula. Direct responsibility for that crimes is on Vladimir Putin, says Lithuanian MP Petras Auštrevičius.
President Putin, you keep lying to the whole world. As a chief commander of your little, polite and green men, you bear your personal responsibility for those who disappeared or were murdered since 2014 in Crimea.
February 11, in the occupied Crimea, searches in the homes of the Crimean Tatars were conducted. Occupation authorities of the peninsula announced the detention of 4 persons within a criminal investigation into the activities of terrorist organization Hizb ut-Tahrir. Instead, Majlis called those searches the wave of repression against the Crimean Tatars. Few days later, the so-called prosecutor of Crimea, Natalia Poklonskaya, submitted to the Supreme Court of the Crimea a statement on the prohibition of Majlis and its recognition as a terrorist organization. In turn, Rifat Chubarov said that the ban of Majlis is another step in Moscow's intention to complete the displacement of the Crimean Tatar people from Crimea.
The threat impends upon thousands of people. We can only imagine the level of such threat. We don't exclude direct repressions in form of detentions of Central Majlis members, and we understand that significant number of members of local Majlises would be displaced from Crimea.
Ukrainian Ministry of Foreign Affairs condemns the decision of Crimean occupation authorities to recognize the Majlis of Crimean Tatars people an extremist organization and to ban it on the territory of the peninsula. Mariana Betsa, the spokesman for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine, called its intentions a continuation of Stalinist repression.
As it is known, human rights is exactly your topic in the Crimean question. So how can you comment briefly all these events, all the situation around the human rights in the peninsula?
Now we speak about gray zone in Crimea. The problem is that according to Ukrainian and international law, Crimea is the occupied territory. According to Russian Federation law, Crimea is the part of the Russian Federation. So if there are any events occurring at the territory of the peninsula, the question is rising how to get there and who can get there. If you flew from the Russian Federation from Moscow to Simferopol or Sevastopol, you violate Ukrainian and international law. If you go via Ukrainian border, you might have later problems with Russian Federation. There are few examples of Russian human rights defenders who are trying to get to Crimea according to Ukrainian law, and that's the hell of bureaucratic procedure, because you need to be personally present in Ukraine, you need to get documents translated into Ukrainian, you need to personally to submit them to the Migrational Service of Ukraine, etc., etc. That takes at least 3 days. And if there is some emergencies, if you need ad hoc way to Crimea, there is only way to go via Moscow. And that arises the question of the information about Crimea. Not only the human rights defending information, but as well journalists' information, the general awareness of the situation, and the ad hoc reaction. And we are trying to establish the easiest situation to get to Crimea and to establish the general position of how you can get to Crimea, what is acceptable way to Crimea in the case of emergencies. And as well, the recent delegation of the European mission of the European Council to Crimea, they went to Crimea through Moscow. According to Ukrainian law, they are violators, so they should get administrative liability. But the Minister of Foreign Affairs himself, he told that, okay, that's acceptable, that's an exclusion. And we came to the situation, there is a law and there are exclusions, which is not acceptable.
I see. And I have quite philosophical question for you. Why Russian Federation acts in this way in Crimea? Because it undermines the point of view that citizens of Crimea feel themselves better with under the Russian authority than under the Ukrainian one. So how can they avoid the critics further?
They cannot avoid critics, but they don't agree with it. For example, the report that made the ODIHR Institute for Democracy and Human Rights of OSCE, they presented it in October 2015, which was made out of open sources materials, which were published mostly by Crimean, Russian and international journalists, which was called by the Russian Federation mission to OSCE as over 100 pages of lie. Mm-hmm. And they were open sources, and nobody knows what's truly going on in places with restricted access. It's not only the courts and the detention centers, it's as well mental facilities or prisons or children's home. So what is the position of our coalition? That's the assurance of international presence in Crimea, the monitoring mission, which will monitor the procedures. So there were at least trying to prevent cases of torture or unhuman behavior or mistreatment of the person who were arrested.
Well, activity of coalition is not only connected with people who are political prisoners.
Not only with people who are political prisoners, because some of Crimean people who were eager to join Russian Federation, they haven't lived there, and they don't have this. They have this idea that they manifested, they went out to the streets, and that's why they joined Russian Federation. No. If you analyze the film Russian production Crimea Way Home, mm-hmm. you can clearly see that it was the political will that returned Crimea home.